Hi, my name is Kristen Chrisman, and I'll be reading to you the part 2 in the series of essays that I've written about the National Security Strategy 2022. I'll eventually be submitting these essays to countercurrents.org so that you'll be able to access the endnotes and all the sources. We've been discussing the claims made within the National Security Strategy 2022, which I refer to as Sullivan and Biden's NSS. Though whether or not National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan actually wrote the document is unknown. Now, claim number 1 we discussed in the last essay, and that was that the claim is that the United States is in the midst of this fierce competition with its foreign adversaries. Claim number 2 is that winning the competition is vital and will make a huge difference in the daily lives of ordinary people and in the ability of light to prevail over darkness. The National Security Strategy 2022, which I refer to as Sullivan and Biden's NSS, revolves around these 3 themes. The USG will compete with its adversaries. The USG will cooperate with its allies. And the USG is the best qualified to lead the world. If the USG, or as they would have us believe, the American people themselves, are in the midst of a fierce competition, and this competition is the primary focus of the NSS, one would think that the NSS would clearly spell out what the competition is over, who's trying to achieve what and why, where they're trying to achieve this in the world, whether what the different competitors want to achieve is mutually incompatible, whether the populations of the nations participating in this competition have voted to compete, how the outcome of the competition will affect the daily lives of the relevant populations, whether there's an option of not being in the competition, and why a competition is necessary, even if there are different goals amongst different groups. But we don't learn any of that. The NSS 2022 is all quite vague. And vagueness, sometimes peppered with specific cherry-picked stories, is a key tool of the demagogue, the crowd stirrer who takes advantages of the passions and frustrations of the crowd to channel them into hatred and violence against his own enemy, supposedly for the crowd's freedom and safety, but actually for his own selfish purposes. To prevent such vague wording and demagogic dynamics from steering the world into biological and nuclear war, let's get down to specific details that we all can understand. As leaders of the United States, Sullivan and Biden should be able to participate in a public cooperative dialogue, preferably with representatives from the governments of China and Russia, and answer these questions. How would Sullivan and Biden describe a typical day in the life of an average American and an average Russian if the USG were to win the, quote, race to the top? And to be more precise, can we get a comparison of the lives of poor, lower class, middle class, upper class, and super wealthy Americans and Russians in the event of a USG win of this race to the top? And how would they describe a typical day in those lives if Russia or China won the competition? What precisely are we talking about with regard to how this competition and its outcome affect the daily lives of a spectrum of ordinary people, including those of different socioeconomic classes, genders, and ages, outside the social and business circles that run U.S. foreign policy? Are Sullivan and Biden actually able to make these descriptions? Are their notions of the outcomes actually just fuzzy guesswork? Or does the competition's outcome really only affect a very small group of Americans within certain social and business circles? How would Russian and Chinese policymakers respond to these same questions? Americans deserve nothing less than answers to those questions. As described in part 1 of this series, Sullivan and Biden's claim that the competition is over the ability of the USG to continue to pursue its vision of freedom, openness, prosperity, and security is clearly far-fetched and not supported by evidence. So the next clue we get as to the nature of this competition and what it's all about is that the USG will cooperate with those nations that share its interests and vision for the world. Of course, we already know that when the USG says interest, they don't mean the interests of the American people. They mean the financial and psychological interests of those social and business circles who determine U.S. foreign policy. I don't recall anything about life in the United States getting better over my lifetime. In fact, things are worse, especially with regard to the environment, overpopulation, traffic, money, the general competence of people, and the sickening escalation of wars and weapon exports. Yet, if every U.S. president for the past several administrations has been supposedly pursuing and satisfying U.S. interests, wouldn't you think our lives would be improving by now if those interests were really about us? If the USG wins this competition, it won't increase my access to wild nature that's free from tick-borne diseases so I can kick through the leaves with my dog, carefree. It won't result in less excavation and fresher, sweeter air. It won't create more trees and habitat for animals. It won't make my national grid and spectrum bills decrease so I can better afford food at the grocery store. It won't improve my chances of getting published or getting a satisfying job. It won't improve workplace cultures. A USG win won't improve public school culture. It won't stop the oppression and sleep deprivation of children in the narrow-minded push for good grades. It won't make American children on the school bus and in the school cafeteria friendlier to one another. It won't improve quality and variety of music on the radio or in grocery store speakers. It won't put less broken glass in the park. It won't keep cats from wandering loose outside and killing rabbits and birds. It won't keep violence and sex from dominating the movies. It won't give me access to incandescent light bulbs. And it won't make computer monitors revert back 2 decades to their former gentle lighting that didn't damage the eyes. A USG win also won't decrease traffic. It won't give us more options of petroleum-free and chemical-free clothing that doesn't make us break out into a sweat. It won't stop manufacturers from pouring more and more fever-inducing chemicals into bed mattresses. It won't keep lead from contaminating dark chocolate. It won't require manufacturers to reveal heavy metal and chemical content. It won't stop the despicable slaughter of cattle, pigs, lambs, and bison. It won't counter overpopulation. It won't reduce crowd density at the beach. It won't give me access to a quiet lake to swim where my feet can't reach the bottom. A USG win in this race to the top. It won't stop the sound of leaf blowers and bring back rakes and brooms. It won't improve the quality of life. It won't improve my health. It won't give any quality, uncontaminated land back to the Native Americans. It won't improve the dismal state of U.S. mental health care. It won't relieve American depression or anxiety. It won't offer Americans any easier access to opportunities to earn a living from their own creative skills and talents, rather than from filling their souls as worker ants in local chain stores. A USG win in this race to the top won't increase the accountability of U.S. presidents and high officials to international law. It won't improve the mostly dismal choices we've been given every 4 years for U.S. president. It won't stop U.S. presidents from spending millions swirling about in fancy clothes at their inaugural balls, which we're expected to admire. It won't stop NATO from performing its idiotic, taxpayer-funded war simulations. It won't stop the CIA and National Endowment for Democracy from facilitating coups. It won't stop the U.S. weapon industry's grip on U.S. foreign policy. And it certainly won't decrease the amount of lies in the U.S. propaganda that inundates mainstream media. So whatever interests they're talking about, they have nothing to do with me. And most likely they don't have anything to do with you. In fact, a better clue as to what these interests pertain to come from investigative reporter Jeremy Scahill's Blackwater. Scahill describes the way in which the Clinton administration pounced to promote U.S. corporate pipeline interests in the region of the Caspian Sea following the much dreamed of by U.S. policymakers dissolution of the USSR, a dissolution with capitalist reforms that brought poverty and crime to the former republics of the USSR. Already by 1997, Unocal, Amoco, Exxon, and Pennzoil had invested billions of dollars in Azerbaijan. But look carefully at Scahill's quote of reporter Stephen Kinzer. Quote, "The list of private American citizens who are seeking to make money from Azerbaijani oil or to encourage investment here reads like a roster of the national security establishment. Among the most prominent names are former Secretaries of State Henry A. Kissinger and James A. Baker III, former Defense Secretary Dick Cheney, former Treasury Secretary Lloyd Bentsen, former White House Chief of Staff John Sununu, and two former National Security Advisors, Brent Scowcroft and Zbigniew Brzezinski." End quote. So these are the interests of the people that write things like the national security strategy. These are the interests of the national security establishment. They're looking to use for U.S. foreign policy, taxpayer-funded U.S. military security, and taxpayer-funded private military contractors, such as Blackwater, former Blackwater, to secure their own financial interests abroad. That's what national security is likely all about. Sullivan and Biden described their vision as, quote, "a world that is free, open, prosperous, and secure," end quote. As mentioned above, the USG's dedication to these characteristics is bitterly laughable. That was discussed in Part 1. But notice, too, there's nothing in that vision pertaining to a world that is friendly, joyful, loving, caring, just, honest, truthful, intelligent, wise, healthful, or clean. And as you can tell from reading further on in the NSS, open, it turns out, doesn't even mean honest. It means having markets that are open to U.S. investors. China, for example, is specifically condemned for not being, quote, "open and accessible," end quote, and for having its markets closed off to investors. Sullivan and Biden must be just as peeved as U.S. policymakers who sent Commodore Matthew Perry to physically intimidate Japan into opening up to U.S. trade in 1853. Sullivan and Biden state, quote, "The People's Republic of China harbors the intention and, increasingly, the capacity to reshape the international order in favor of one that tilts the global playing field to its benefit, even as the United States remains committed to managing the competition between our countries responsibly," end quote. How would the USG's responsible management of competition affect our lives in a way that is better than the irresponsible way that Sullivan and Biden imply would be used by China to manage this competition? This is not merely a rhetorical question. Sullivan and Biden have a responsibility to answer it thoroughly. We get a definite sense that Sullivan and Biden perceive this competition, or want us to perceive this competition, in terms of moral competition between good and evil. But considering the USG support following World War II for Chiang Kai-shek in China, a brutal dictator infamous for his cruelty, tyranny, corruption, and decadence, a dictator whose forces massacred the people of Taiwan prior to taking over the island for themselves, up to 20,000 of the people. It would be foolish to assume that the USG is on the side of goodness. And considering the USG's history since at least the early 1900s of struggling to access markets and investments in China, it would be naive not to consider, is the USG's blessed vision simply one in which U.S. policymakers and businessmen make the most profit and investments, and the, quote, darker vision of its adversaries, such as China, is one in which China and other nations make more profits and investments? Is this the alpha and omega of U.S. policymakers' vision of morality? It's likely that the USG, as it did during the Cold War, is masking its avaricious, low-minded ambition to win a competition for profits with a fraudulent cover of high-minded morality. And it's also likely that in many U.S. policymaker minds, they're deceiving themselves, seeing their greed not as greed, but as victory for the good guys. Sullivan and Biden, please answer. If China did tilt the global playing field to its benefit, how would life be better, worse, or the same for a spectrum of Americans, Chinese, and people of several other nations around the world? The United States is one of the wealthiest nations in the world. Wouldn't it actually be fair to tilt the global playing field so that it's not tilted towards the United States? Certainly, many Americans find it difficult to make ends meet. But the USG doesn't need to profit unfairly off other nations to help Americans. The USG has never used its foreign-made profits to help the American population anyway. Those profits just enhance the lifestyles of the social and business circles that run U.S. foreign policy, like the $1.3 million that 4 Biden family members gained collectively from deals in China, primarily from the Chinese energy company State Energy HK Hong Kong Limited. It makes you wonder, is Biden trying for war with China in order to get U.S. puppets in power over there? Puppets such as those connected with State Energy HK Limited, who will help certain Americans reap millions in profits. And likely, he's trying to do that in Russia too. Topple Putin, assassinate him, this principled leader, who I hope you're all listening to in his speeches, and replace him with somebody who will give the social and business circles that run the United States, give them the deals they want. There's no need to tilt the international playing field towards such a wealthy nation as the United States when other nations need much more help. And we can raise a similar point with regard to economic relations within the United States. Wouldn't it be fair to tilt the national playing field so that it's not tilted towards the super wealthy Americans? To help the American population, the USG needs to create policies that facilitate a much more egalitarian sharing and earning of the wealth within our nation, so that certain players, such as weapon industry CEOs, don't get an enormously unfair advantage. Of course, any suggestion to make things more egalitarian is slammed as communist. It's like a little trick to make all of us think, oh, we don't want an equal share of the wealth because that would be communist and that would just be awful. I'm not talking about communism. I'm talking about people earning what they deserve to earn for what they work at. People paying what they should be paying in taxes if they earn a whole lot. Being egalitarian does not imply communism. And not every form of communism isn't the same either. So just because something's communism doesn't mean it's evil either. But they'll slam anything that promotes our getting an equal share or more of an equal share of the wealth as communist. With a little trick to fool us into thinking, oh, we don't want that. How could one American's hour of work be worth hundreds of times more than another American's hour of work? And how could one American's 50 years of work be worth thousands or even millions or billions of times more than another American's 50 years of work? It's ridiculous to suggest that we should be angry with China or Russia for our lack of prosperity when we know it's the fault of greedy Americans. The NSS 2022 fails to offer convincing evidence that the USG has any type of golden vision worth pursuing. The document claims that adversaries have a, quote, darker vision, but though such Star Wars type hints of darkness are likely intended to make us shudder and quake, Sullivan and Biden fail to describe this darker vision in any coherent terms, thus indicating the absence of such a darker vision. It seems to me that achieving Sullivan and Biden's vision of freedom, openness, prosperity, and security, as limited as it is, requires improving life within the United States by using our U.S. tax dollars, energy, and talent to directly address problems that ordinary Americans face, not by using up U.S. tax dollars on fighting foreign adversaries who have nothing to do with any of the constraints on that vision, and who certainly shouldn't be blamed, much less killed, over such false accusations. Are we supposed to assume that Russia and China will somehow destroy life for Americans more than Americans and the USG already destroy life for Americans? Unless the USG provokes them into attacking us, which it's not above doing, that's hard to believe. It's important that the questions raised in this essay, including questions regarding a typical day for various people depending upon who wins the race to the top, be answered. Cooperative dialogue would give Sullivan and Biden the opportunity to defend their positions by providing detailed answers to these questions. Or perhaps they'll see that the race is not so important to win after all, or that it can be a cooperative, enjoyable game that we all play, with no adversaries, rather than a race to the top with a single winner who wins not much more than a bigger fall into the mud. Thank you very, very much for listening.